September 11th, 2001. Many people will remember where they were on that date. I was a nursing student at the time, and I was at the St. Mary's Hospital in Montreal on the psychiatry ward. Psychiatry wards have TVs in the common area, and I remember seeing people standing around watching with a lot of intensity that day. I remember looking at the screens and seeing burning towers, but still not really understanding what I was looking at. I remember that the announcers didn't know if the plane crash was intentional or an accident. Then one of the nurses had to leave because she wanted to make sure her family in New York was safe. It was surreal to think that a plane just crashed into a building, but our guest today has lived all over the world, and it just so happens that he was in New York on that very day, which made everything even more real for him.
As a new arrival to North America, I thought it'd be great to do the Boston Marathon, which I eventually did in 2004. I did a terrible time in really hot conditions. And then I kind of forgot about Boston until 2013 and the horrendous bombings, which I'm sure everyone will remember. For me, that meant I had to go back in 2014 and run again. Like so many other runners, I was driven by the love and solidarity of my sport to show support for Boston. So in 2014, there we were, walking to the start in Hopkinton, flanked by police every 10 meters along the road, with troops watching from the rooftops. Everybody had received their race shirts. On the back were big letters, Boston Strong. And the stranger next to me spoke for all of us when he said something like this, if I remember it rightly. If people want to tell us that we should be afraid to do something, they really shouldn't start with runners. As I ran that race, I really felt like I was part of history.
Hi, and welcome to the Running Book Reviews podcast, where we review running books to help you decide if you would like to read the book for yourself. We also hope that listening to us chat about running can help keep you motivated about your own running, or maybe inspire you to try something new. My name is Liz, and with my co-host Alan, we're going to talk with author Roger Robinson about his book, When Running Made History.
When Running Made History is based on the author's memory of historic running events, which he witnessed throughout his life, starting with the 1948 Olympic Games in London. If you remember, we did a podcast about Emil Zatopek, and he appears in that famous Olympic Games. That was when Roger was 9 years old, and his uncle brought him to watch some track events. It borders on being a historic reference about running because a lot of facts were added about each event and the circumstances at the time. Chapters in the book are titled with the date and location in chronological order from the 1948 London Olympics to October 2016, when he saw the first woman over 65 run under 20 minutes for the 5K. Readers will marvel at how many historic moments the author witnessed throughout his life. So let me tell you a bit about Roger. Roger Robinson is a true fan of the sport of running. He was born in England, but has moved to several countries throughout his life to run, and even ended up marrying another famous runner who I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about. Roger was an elite runner in the 60s and 70s, running cross-country world events on several occasions, including for the England team in 1966 and the New Zealand team in 1977. He then went on to be a high-level masters athlete, running a masters world record for the marathon in Vancouver in 1981. Of course, you're all interested in knowing that he ran a time of 2 hours, 18 minutes, 44. My goodness. He also set other records, including an over 50s marathon record. Roger has a PhD in literature from Cambridge University. Is there anything that this man can't do? He followed up with a lectureship at the University of Canterbury and was professor in English at the University of Wellington. He was also an announcer at some big running events and became a great running writer. He's authored and co-authored several other books, including Running in Literature and 26.2 marathon stories with his famous wife, Katherine Switzer. Welcome, Roger. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's very much appreciated. Great to be on a podcast devoted to the thing I really love at the minute, which is books about running.
We definitely love books too, about running, especially.
So When Running Made History, what prompted you to write this one?
let me just reel back just a second, if I may, and
Please do.
just follow up on that and just say how great it is, I think, that you're doing this, that you and Liz have decided to do this podcast, because one of my campaigns at the minute, if you like, in life, is to try and get writing about running taken more seriously than it usually is. Just recently, I'm currently in New Zealand during the COVID crisis. And just recently, I took part in a literary festival, a books festival. And it's the first time that any book festival that I've known of has had a session on sports writing, which I convened, talking about this book. And I got a guy who's a rugby commentator to talk about a rugby book, and a woman who's written a book about hockey to talk about her book. Some great books. But people generally don't take sports writing as serious as if it was capable of being good literature. And that's something in my campaign. So I know that's not the only thing you're doing on this program, but just congratulations on the whole idea.
Thanks for that. And
giving some prominence to writing about running.
And I would say we find that a little strange, because we've been doing these podcasts for a year and a half now, and the vast majority of authors that we talk with are professional journalists or literary educated people. You know, they're not comic book writers, so to speak, and really the authors themselves deserve the respect of being taken seriously. So let's hope that together we can advance the cause a bit.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, and then my answer to your question is relevant to that, because this book started as really, it was going to be a history of modern running. I could see the need for that. Nobody's done that. Running is a really important part of late 20th and early 20th century history. It's something that takes over whole cities, that's transformed millions of lives, that people take seriously, and so on, and has generated a whole cultural industry like this podcast. But nobody's yet sat down and written the history of it. So I started to do that, and I found that I was realizing I'd actually been around on quite a lot of important occasions. Like I'd been at the 1948 Olympics, and I'd seen Abebe Bikila go by. I won't say I saw him run the whole of his marathon in 1960. I saw him for 2 seconds in 1960 because I was standing there in the crowd. I saw Murray Halberg and Peter Snell do their great hour for New Zealand. And I realized that I'd actually seen a lot of these things, and I began to realize that I won't say anybody could do the history, but perhaps what I should do first is write my eyewitness history. And then other people can incorporate that. So that was one way in which this book began. It was going to be that history. Then it turned into the eyewitness history of things that I had personally seen with that special observation. The book is not about me. It's not about my life, but it's about me as observer, if you like, me, the things that I saw. And I changed from being a 9-year-old boy to a 78-year-old master's runner in the course of the book. And there's some reflections about that process. And, you know, who are we? What is your identity? How is that 78-year-old guy different from the 9-year-old boy? In fact, the answer is very little. And so then there was another element to it when I realized that a lot of the important events in history, in running history, were actually important events in history. That really started with one that you and Liz didn't mention in your intro, when I was at the Berlin Marathon in 1990. And that was 3 days before the reunification of Germany. The wall had come down, and that marathon was the absolute highlight of the celebrations. The reunification celebrations were relatively low key, and you could see why the Germans didn't want to get too much mass excitement. And so it was the marathon that actually expressed all the wonder of the breaking down of the communist wall and the opening up of Europe to completely free movement, which the marathon symbolized by going through both parts of Berlin. And I realized that day, so something else going on here that's not just a race. You know, this is not just Steve Monaghetti and Uta Pippig winning the race and me crapping out and dropping out of the race. This is actually a historic event, and I need to record it like that. And then as I was putting the book together, I realized, as you said at the beginning, or as Liz said, I had been in New York on 9/11 and had run in Central Park that day and had watched the New York Marathon 8 weeks later and saw everything that came in between. I was in Boston as a journalist in 1913 at the time of the bombings, and they came into the press room and said, "We're in lockdown, there's been an incident." I was there in 2014, and I got at the last minute taken off the women's race because they decided that that was likely to be won by an American, and so they'd have one of the staff writers do that. And I as a freelancer got the men. Well, I got really lucky that day because the men's race was
Run by
won
an American.
by Meb Keflezighi. And so I ended up with the prime assignment for. So that became the third element in the book. And from a literary point of view, and I'm going back to my claim that sports writing can be good literature, this is actually three major strands which are interwoven on every page. There's the history of running strand, there's the running as history strand, and there's my personal history and observation strand. And those three things weave and vary and enable me to give a completely unique perspective and to open the book up to all kinds of different experiments in how to write, which we could, I mean, from the first chapter, which is, if any of your listeners have studied literature, I call it my portrait of the artist as a young man chapter, where it's written through the eyes and in the language of a 9-year-old boy, and through to other things. Oh, like watching the Olympic marathon in 1960, when I only saw 2 seconds of the race, because that's what you do as a marathon spectator.
Mm-hmm.
You're
because
on the side of the road.
You don't have a live stream back then. So.
No, you know nothing about what's going on. All of a sudden they go whoosh and they've gone by. And so this is a challenge to me to write an entire chapter based on 2 seconds of observation. So there were different literary challenges that I set myself. I mean, another one to come to mind was describing the great race between Chris Chataway and Vladimir Kutz in 1954 in London, which was run at night. And in those days, you have to realize, you know, we didn't have full flash floodlights or anything like that. This is still impoverished post-war Britain.
This was at White City.
This is White City.
Yeah.
And,
I always remember White City as a greyhound dog racing track.
It was, exactly. Oh. And as spectators, you were distant from the running track because the running track was inside the greyhound track.
Oh, okay.
So you were a long way back. But what they did that night was that they had 2 wartime searchlights, which they'd mounted up at the top of the stand, and they tried to follow the lead runners with these 2 searchlights.
Oh my goodness.
And of course, a lot of the time they missed, and the runners would go in and out of darkness. So I call that chapter my film noir chapter, you know, because it's all full of images of dark and light, and there's Chataway wearing all white and with his red light-colored red hair, and so he's the kind of symbol of whiteness, and he ends it in and so on in the pool of light. So there are all these different ways of writing that the book opened up to me, and I hope that people will enjoy both the writing as well as the subject matter.
What we see early on is in fact some photographs of the autographs that you collected from some of the famous runners, and so, you know, being around a 10-year-old, you're already a fanboy of some of these elite runners. So how did you become a fan of running? When did that first start? Well,
we lived in a suburb of London called New Malden. I was actually born in Birmingham, but my father was in war factory work. He was an amputee, so couldn't be in the army, and he was working near London at that time. And about half a mile down the road was the running track of London University, called Motspur Park. And that was one of the great tracks of that era. Cinders, of course, in those days, but good quality cinders. And London University had their meets there, and various other meets like the Surrey Championships would be there. And I would go as a little boy and crawl through the hedge to get in to watch the runners both racing and training. Interestingly, I heard one of the guys who read my book went on later. He had run in the same area of London, though we didn't know each other because he went to a different school. And he came to Canada and later and became CEO of Athletics Canada, a man called John Thresher. And John let me know that he too had crawled through the hedge to watch the athletes at Motsford Park, which at least authenticated my story. At least I could quote that and show that I didn't just make it up. That I crawled through the hedge, and he was coming from the other side of the suburb, and he was crawling through the hedge. We didn't know each other, but obviously there was quite a horde of little boys who would gather, of course, around the steeplechase to watch the runners hopefully fall into the water. That was our great ambition. But yes, I was there, and I had, like all boys, I had my heroes, and my two main ones at that time were actually both West Indians who were running with London University. One was called Arthur Wint, who was an 800-meter 400 runner, and the other was a sprinter called MacDonald Bailey. And I'm very proud of the fact I got their autograph. And I also got Roger Bannister's autograph. I was about 13 or 14 by then, on the day when he ran an unofficial world record for 3/4 of a mile, for 3 laps, which was the day that showed him and me as a watcher and others that actually the 4-minute mile was going to be a possibility. And I got his autograph after that race. So yes, that was part of youthful enthusiasm, and one that I'm really proud of. Alan, you mentioned Emil Zatopek. Well, I met him at a dinner later, and got his autograph, and he always signed his autograph by showing himself pursued by his wife with her javelin.
Dana.
Yeah, that was amazing.
Yes, a nice witty little joke, because she was an Olympic. She won the Olympic javelin on the same day that he won the Olympic 10,000 meters.
He had an interesting life. My parents immigrated from the Czech Republic, so I heard about Emil Zatopek when I was a kid, but not to the extent that maybe I should have. It was just my dad used to say, "Oh, Emil Zatopek," like I knew that he won the 10,000, the 5,000, and the marathon in the Olympics, and I knew that he would go in and run with the same training group sometimes that my dad was with, but he was kind of like sort of the previous generation. They were probably about a generation apart, and that's pretty much all I heard until we really read his whole life story, and it's kind of funny to see how he signs with the little pictogram. Yeah, it's very cute.
You're lucky to have that connection, Liz. I mean, he was one of the absolute greats, and that's partly why I wrote the first chapter about him. I was very lucky. It would be 2012, the AIMS conference, that's the Association of International Marathons, was in Prague, and they invited my wife Katherine Switzer and me to be their speakers. And attached to that, there was a special occasion to honor Zatopek for the 50th anniversary of his 3 gold medals in the 1952 Olympics.
Wow.
Or 60th anniversary or something. And it was a special Zatopek celebration, which was filled not only with running people, but diplomats and sort of quite high level. And I was asked to be the speaker. And I decided, because I hadn't actually been at those 1952 Olympics, I decided that I would talk about my encounter with Zatopek, which was as a little boy seeing him win his first gold medal in 1948. Even though that wasn't the occasion that was being specially celebrated, but it enabled me to get the charisma of the man and how he combined this ability to raise everybody's sights in terms of how hard he trained and how hard he raced. And he just took the ideas of training way beyond what anybody else had done before. And yet at the same time, he was always unfailingly a really nice, sweet-natured man. So he was a fierce competitor who at the same time could actually be encouraging his rivals and watching him run that race. He lapped most of the field, and every time he lapped somebody, he would kind of jog alongside them for a few strides and pat them on the shoulder and encourage them. And it was amazing to see this. And this was 1948, when we were all being brainwashed to think that communists were evil people and they'd taken over from the Nazis and we were going to fight them and so on. And there he was running in his red communist singlet. And at the same time, being a totally nice person. And I still remember how at the age of 9, that really kind of opened my eyes to what the complexities of sport, how sport can be just totally competitive and yet at the same time totally collaborative. those two things can go to, you're part of a community, even though you're trying to race each other's guts off.
Yeah, like when the gun goes off, it's like everybody for themselves, but then you cross the finish line and your buddies, and you go and have dinner together.
Absolutely, and Zatopek embodied that, and that's what I tried to capture in that first chapter of the book. Is both the way he really raised the sights of the whole sport, and just raised standards and set standards that all of us aspired to for many years afterwards, and yet at the same time was always this friendly, supportive, totally amiable personality. And then, of course, later, and I use this in the speech as well, I mean, he became quite a hero of the 1968 stand by the Czechs against the Russian occupation, and he was disgraced, officially disgraced because of it, and was had to work as a garbage collector, and so they systematically tried to humiliate him, and so he's a hero in Czech Republic, not only for his running, but also for his integrity and for standing for the country rather than for the occupying power.
So you kind of started to touch on how, sports writing is not considered very literary, but you really wanted to write about sport way, way before you wrote this book. And back when, it was kind of, it wasn't even really considered anything you could pursue. So how did you finally end up writing about running?
I suppose because I've always liked writing, and I've always liked writing about what I'm interested in, and I've published, I suppose, over 20 books altogether. Most of them on different aspects of literature. They've been editions of novels, a big book called The Oxford Companion to New Zealand Literature, which is a complete guide to our literature. Editions of Catherine Mansfield and Samuel Butler and H.G. Wells and Thomas Hardy, and that's been my kind of professional occupation. But at the same time, I just always liked writing about running and reading good books about running. And now in my retirement, I can choose what I'm going to write about. And I look around, and others of my contemporaries, a lot of them are still writing, and one's writing another book about Jane Austen, and others are writing short stories and poems and so on. And I could be doing that. But by chance, I have found both a subject and an audience who really take that subject seriously. I found a subject which is really important in hundreds of thousands of people's lives, and which the importance of it has never really been articulated. There aren't enough books telling people, how important running can be. There are probably plenty talking about it from an individual health point of view. How to lose weight, how to do more training. That's self-improvement, and that's all fine. That's an important part of it. What I do is more look at the big picture and try and say how important it is to our society, to our culture, the values that it brings in, what it does by its inclusivity, by its non-judgmental quality. In running, you judge people entirely by how fast they run. Mm-hmm. You don't judge them by how good looking they are, or how much money they've got, or what job they do, or whether their uncle was the king, or what. None of that is important in the slightest. And so you can line up against people. And I sometimes say as a joke, I've made friends through running right through society. I've known taxi drivers and farmers and garbage collectors, and right down the social scale to lawyers and politicians. So that's actually a joke.
Oh, I see. You got the politicians at the. I switched off a little bit there. Okay, I'll return your compliment. Have you heard of the Greek root definition of politics? It's two words: poly meaning many, and ticks meaning blood-sucking insects.
Yes.
Apologies to all our politician listeners.
Oh no, that's right.
Let's hope there are no politicians listening.
Politicians and lawyers are used to being made fun of. That's all right. It goes with the territory. But yes, the important point is that as a writer, I've got an important subject matter which is enormously rich, My main interest, I suppose, is in the history of it, is in the history of running. But I've also been a reporter of major marathons and an announcer and so on. And the challenge there is that the body of knowledge that you're an expert in changes every few days.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not easy to keep up with it, which is perhaps why now I'm at an age now when I'm beginning to focus more on the history. One of the jobs I do for Runner's World is I write their obituaries, and that might sound a bit ghoulish, but actually it's not. It's a really important literary job. When you think of, we'll say you're an ordinary person reading magazines or websites, what are the things which are perhaps the most important and emotionally gripping for you would be reading obituaries. So from a literary point of view, it's really important to do them well and to get them right and to estimate the person properly and to tell the story of their life in a way that will satisfy the people who knew and loved them well, but also inform all the people who only knew them very slightly. And so that again is a very interesting literary challenge. And so that's one major thing that I do now. And of course, sometimes you have to work very fast as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because things can be unexpected.
Yeah.
So I just think the running community is so varied and huge and challenging in the best way. It's full of interesting, committed people who are wanting quality material. And my only complaint about the running community is that they don't buy enough books.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're aiming to change that. Maybe they just don't know about all those.
That's what's so great about it. And of course, the worst thing, just to tell anybody who's thinking of running literature or pleasing running writers, if you meet somebody who's written a running book, please don't say, "Oh, I loved your book. I borrowed it from a friend," or "I've lent it to all my friends." That's the most tactless thing you can say.
From a personal point of view, I think from reading and try to encourage our listeners to go out and get the book. I think I like reading the bits where you or someone will describe a race and it stirs the blood, because as runners, we've all been there and tried to stretch our ability right to the limit, or race somebody to the finish, or hold somebody off who's pushing us, or achieve a personal goal. And then when you read a little piece which describes that well, I think you get your juices flowing and it stirs the blood, I think would be my way of describing it. And I think many of the little descriptions that you give, because they're very personal, you were there, have that effect. So, in your book, in the chapters, there are lots of little aspects of that. So I was finding, "Ooh, that makes me feel, that gets me going. I want to go out and run now." And then I'd read the next chapter and say, "Ooh, that's getting me going again."
Yeah, well, thank you. You're right. I was really trying to do that. And what I was trying to do, because of the life I've had and the way I've interacted with running in a whole lot of different roles, I was trying to use each of those roles to give a different perspective. So people have written about running from the spectator's point of view. I'm not sure that anybody's written about it from a 9-year-old child's point of view, as I did. I'm not sure that anybody's written about it from the point of view of somebody standing watching a marathon and seeing only 2 seconds of the race. I don't think anybody's ever written about running seen through the eyes of the stadium announcer, and with a special which I did for the Commonwealth Games in Christchurch in 1974, and the special challenges that you have because you're working so hard and you're trying to watch so many different things at once, and you're not allowed to give information to the competitors and so on. And so that again was a different angle. And then from a television commentator's point of view, how do you introduce a 100 meters when you know that 3/4 of the field are on drugs? And how do you say that without being sued?
Saying it.
and so on. And then, Alan, I think the ultimate challenge, which I tried to get at certain moments, is to describe a race from both the outside, as it looks, and also from the inside, as it feels. And in the last chapter of the book, I decided I would describe a race from the inside. And this was me running in the World Over 50 Championships in this great battle I had with a wonderful Irishman called Jim McNamara. And so that is a race from the inside. That's a kind of stream of consciousness, what it felt like, how I saw it, how the first time I saw him was just as a number 50 bouncing up and down on the back of his singlet, because we all had 40 or 45 or 50 on the back. And so then I suddenly saw this 50. I thought, oh God, there's somebody in my age group who's ahead of me. And so that whole race was done from the inside. So the book tries to get that combination of the two. And we can all turn on YouTube now, and we can watch Herb Elliott, or we can watch a baby Bikila, but it's still not the same as good writing, because good writing can do so much more than something which is only visual can do, because you can get the thoughts and you can get the significance and you can weave in why this matters as well as what happened.
And it's so relatable when you wrote about seeing the guy with the number 50 in front of you, and then you said, oh, well, I'm going to try and not make myself noticeable for a while, because you weren't sure, do you want him to know you're there or not? Or do you want to just pass him at the end? And it was all this like, ooh, I think we've probably all thought about that during a race.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to get that sense of tactics. I don't write coaching books very much, but obviously as an older runner, I end up giving a lot of advice to people in a sort of general mentorship way, and so I try to indicate some things about tactics and pace judgment in the course of the race. And it's the usual message of somebody like me that's got no finishing sprint, which is that you've got to do something before.
So you got to work with your strengths.
That's right. You got to find your strengths and find the other people's weaknesses if you can, and you kind of smell when the moment comes to make a break.
I think it would be a good thing to mention in this podcast one person I had never heard of, and that apparently nobody in the U.S. remembers, even though he was a U.S. citizen, and that's Buddy Edelin.
Yeah.
So who was Buddy Edelin, and why is this poor guy not remembered more than he is? I mean, he just sounded like he was a pioneer. I mean, he went to train with the best in the world, moved away from home, and I mean, he should be a legend, but somehow he's not.
I mean, I have to say, I must have recognized almost every name in the book because they're historically significant, except for this chap, Buddy Edelin.
Oh, that's interesting. See, you're not quite old enough, Alan. But in my day,
thank you.
Well, Liz just said, Buddy decided Europe was, if he was going to be a distance runner, he had to get out of America and go to Europe, and then he had to go to England and get into that whole cross-country road running, track running culture that I was a fringe member of. And he was one of the best runners in the UK at that time. And he would be at all the major road races, and he was running for Chelmsford Athletic Club, just running for his little local club.
So this is in the 60s?
This is in the 60s, yeah. And we called him our Yank. You know, people got kind of quite fond of him. We sort of adopted him as our tame American. And he was a very nice man, very dedicated. The reason he hasn't been more famous in America is that ultimately he didn't win an Olympic medal. And his timing was just a little bit wrong. He broke the world record in 1963, but he was such a dedicated, almost fanatical trainer. He's cited often as an example of overtraining, which I think is a bit tough. He over-raced more than overtrained. And the result was that he was getting sciatica. He ran the Yonkers Marathon to qualify for the American Olympic team in very hot weather, won it by something like 20 minutes, and suffered with sciatica ever after that. And so by the time he got to the 1964 Olympics, he had actually held the world record. It had been taken from him by then, but not by a baby Bikila. And so he actually went into the 1964 Olympics with a faster personal time than a baby Bikila. And if the race had been held a year earlier, he might have got a medal. That's all you can say. But he disappeared. He did all his running outside America, almost all of it. And so he just kind of slipped through. And America at that time wasn't very interested in distance running. They didn't discover distance running till the 1964 Olympics, when Billy Mills won the 10,000 meters and Bob Schull won the 5,000 meters. And then all of a sudden, America was interested in distance running. And then Frank Shorter won the marathon in 1972. And then we became fanatical about the marathon. And that was the story. Buddy Edlund was, as you said, Liz, he was the pioneer, and the pioneer just disappeared because he didn't actually achieve, I mean, he got a world record, which is probably enough for most of us, but he didn't achieve enough in that context to make him famous. And it was Billy Mills going through and winning that astonishing race in 1964 that just took America's imagination. And of course, Billy Mills did it on television, whereas Buddy Edlund was running cross-country races in England without a camera within 50 miles.
Oh, poor guy.
Yes, it was a sad story. And as I said in the book, I met him later in life and had a very nice exchange with him. And I met him at the time, but not closely. But I was one of the group of runners after one cross-country race when Buddy, I think, had finished second, and his contact lens popped out just before the finish, and there were about 12 or 20 of the south of England's top runners all crawling around in the grass trying to find Buddy Edlund's contact. One of the more bizarre moments I remember.
Sort of a follow-up event. Hunt for the contact lens. Yeah, I won the duathlon, the national cross country and contact lens search.
Yeah, but he was part of our community, but he was better known in Britain than he was in America, unfortunately. He's coming up, he's been included in one or two halls of fame and things like that, and people are beginning to remember him now. And I think my chapter helped a lot. And there was a very good book about him, I should say, which I use quite a lot, by a man called Frank Murphy. They're very good, one of the best written running books you'll find anywhere. His life of Buddy Edlund.
Oh, we'll have to put that on our list.
Yeah.
Yes.
Our list is getting very long. As somebody who has an Australian passport, one of the chapters I was quite interested in was your description of Ron Clark, a phenomenal Australian runner, and his 3 mile. I think it was not a 5,000 meters, but a 3 mile.
3 miles.
World record in 1965 in London. What was so special about that?
Well, I think because he broke the record by so much, and because he ran with such kind of magisterial confidence. When you read his stuff and talk to him, he actually didn't feel that confident inside, but he looked like he was a big man with a perfect kind of fluid, upright stride, and he was always bigger than almost anybody else in the field. And at that time, a really good 3 miles was 13:12 or something like that. I'd run a really good one, broke a Surrey County record running 13:41. Well, Ron Clark broke 13 minutes. He ran 12:50 something that day, and it was just a start. It was like some of the breakthroughs we're seeing now, like the sub 2 hour marathon or something. It was something that was so huge, the breakthrough, that we realized we were watching something completely new. And I wanted to write about that day because it was so emotional and powerful, being in the crowd and seeing that and witnessing it and getting the crowd's reaction when we all knew that we were watching history being made. And then I had to stretch a bit to think of its wider significance. And what I realized was that watching that and watching standards rise, being lifted in that way. This is still 1965, and my generation, I was born just before World War II, and so was a child through the later years of World War II. My generation and the generation or two after, people born, say, between 1939, 1938 and, say, 1950, we were in a world that needed improving. And I was trying to define what it felt like being part of that generation. I think it's quite different from how the world is now, where people have had much more material comfort, and it's harder for the individual to find a sense of purpose and creativity. for us, it was a matter of finding something where you could make a contribution. And we weren't ambitious. You know, I'm not saying that we were looking to make a lot of money or anything like that. It was more that you felt in whatever you did, there was going to be room for you to do it well. And this was going to contribute to a society that was trying to rebuild itself after the war. And I think watching Clark do that, I remember talking about it afterwards and realizing that, well, as I said, I think the title I used for the chapter was "The Mountain Grows Higher." Well, the mountain had grown higher, and then what are you going to do about it? You're going to give up trying because all of a sudden the top has gone a lot further away than it used to be, or are you going to keep on grinding along and doing the best you can? And that's basically what we all did. And so all in our different ways of that generation all tried to make those contributions. There were some remarkable people, you know, when you look at the fields for races like the Olympic 5,000 meters in 1972, say, which was won by Viren. That's a race I'd quite like to write about. I wasn't there, but you know, sport which used to be dominated by privileged university people in the years between the wars. Look at that field in 1972, and the only university graduate in that entire field was Steve Prefontaine, who was a blue-collar lad from Coos Bay and was at university because of his running ability, and the rest were, you know, Puttermans and Dave Bedford and Ian Stewart and Viren, and they were blokes who'd been born into relative, certainly I won't say poverty necessarily, but certainly no privilege, and who'd found an amateur sport where if you worked hard, you got results. and I think Ron Clark embodied all of that. So that's why I wanted to write about it, because he did it on sheer hard work.
I like that about running, that it's, you know, I mean, I know that now it's a little different because there are a lot of distractions you can have. You know, you can make running as expensive as you want it to be, basically, because now you have all these shoes with carbon fiber plates and GPS watches and all that. But for a long time, running was just you run, and the harder you run, well, the better you get. And I think that at the base, it's still like that, even though we have, you know, now we have access to, you can buy, you know, whatever you want for running as an accessory. But I mean, you still have to put in the work, because like, the accessories won't do the work for you. I mean, your carbon fiber shoes are not going to run for you if you don't train. So I don't know. I think that in some ways running is still like that, but you know, in others it's changed a little bit. And you actually mentioned sort of later in the book, and I guess that's going to mean we're bouncing around a little bit here, but you do mention the cost of those big city marathons, how it's in some ways it takes away from that, because, you know, it's not just anyone that can enter New York, which last time I checked would have been the entry fee is like $400 Canadian, which I mean is a lot of money. But you also say that that running has sort of recognized that they realize that it's you know, that certain races are becoming like kind of expensive, and it's excluding a certain population. So I don't know what you think about that, if you think there's hope that it's gonna change somewhat.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you raised that, Liz. It's first of all, on the equipment and apparel, I am totally retro. And my ideal still would be to run wearing nothing but a pair of shorts. You can't always do that at my age because grass fields aren't as safe as they used to be, for, you know, too much glass around and so on. But I would dispense with shoes if I could, and certainly dispense with everything else. I still use a model of Casio watch, which is at least 40 years old, because it does everything I want. I don't want to have a watch which tells me how fast to run, or because people say, do you wear a heart monitor? And I say, yes, I was born with it. you judge the effort yourself. But then you moved into another aspect, which is something I deal with in one of the later chapters of the book, when I describe what happened in New York in 2012 when the marathon was cancelled because of Superstorm Sandy. And I got involved in that because I was due to be there as a journalist. And the marathon, suddenly, having thought of itself as totally beloved by the city, suddenly found that it was coming in for lot of criticism and actual physical attack as volunteers were trying to prepare for the marathon. The local people were actually physically attacking them because, they had bodies still in flood water in the basement, and no food, and kind of the whole thing was kind of, what are you thinking of, trying to run a marathon at this time? And what I wrote then, thinking about it, was that we realized the sport of running, realized that we're actually not quite as inclusive as we thought we were, in the point that you raised, and we're not quite as loved as we thought we were. And that day was really quite salutary for running. And one or two people I've talked to have criticized me for saying this because they thought it was too negative. Well, I'll stand by it. I think it was a very salutary lesson that running had to learn. And what I said was, we can't go on expecting poor people to stand on their streets and cheer for rich people, which is a simplified way of putting it, but nevertheless, there's some truth in that. All our city events depend on the support of the communities, which means we're going through their homes. And I deliberately included a picture taken by a friend of mine, Canadian friend, which, because he's Polish Canadian, and he just took this picture of the runners going by a Polish sausage shop somewhere in Brooklyn, I think, or the Bronx, I've forgotten. And I wanted to show how the race goes through the communities, actually in the place where people live. So we're asking, we're inviting ourselves sort of almost through their front doors. So we need to do a bit more to make them feel included, is what that chapter says. And to its great credit, New York Roadrunners worked very hard then to set up races in Queens and in Staten Island, and to reach out to its component communities. And Boston has always been very good at recognizing the communities that its race passes through, and that's an important part of its annual diplomatic exercise. So we have to work with the communities, and coming to running as I did, when it was essentially kind of blue collar sport, harriers. The harriers in the north of England, were just the blokes who could go out and run because they couldn't afford football boots some of the time, or couldn't afford a bicycle. That's literally true. And so sport has changed, and I wouldn't want it to become only a sport for affluent, well-educated, upper middle class people, which it has tended to move in that direction, shall I say, in North America. So we need to work harder to make it more inclusive, and that chapter was a way of kind of focusing on that issue, with what happened to surprise us so much in New York at that time.
So this is a bit of a surprise question. Maybe you have some advice for organizers of the Montreal Marathon, because here in Montreal, we've had a marathon for a long time, and it's changed hands a few times recently. It was rock and roll for a few years, which was not a success. And now there's going to be, since the pandemic, there was going to be a new group taking it over, because there was one year where actually somebody ended up dying during the race, which may have happened regardless, but the whole point was that the emergency service response was not adequate, according to the newspaper article that I read. So the thing is that the race is sort of like, it's got a long history of not really being loved by everyone. Like, you talk about the Montreal Marathon, and oftentimes you'll hear, they're going to close all the streets and all these people. And the thing is, you have bigger cities with more traffic that embrace the marathon. And I don't know if you have any insight to that. I mean, I know you haven't maybe been to the Montreal Marathon, but I don't know what could happen differently to help people accept the street closures on a Sunday morning for people to run through the street.
I don't say anything that would imply that I know anything about Montreal's situation. So this is in no way judgment. I've experienced that kind of public opposition with the Toronto Marathon. There's two marathons in Toronto. There's the Scotia Waterfront, and there's the older Toronto Marathon, which is, and I've actually been speaker at both. and so have experienced them both. And the Toronto Marathon has a lot of trouble with people complaining about traffic closures and so on. My only recommendation is a very general one, that the most successful events are those that have grown out of the community. What doesn't seem to work, and I'm not saying this is the case in Toronto or Montreal, it's not, but what doesn't seem to work is when you bring in a professional race director or a professional group from outside. It's a strange chemistry, and it's the same applies when you try and bring in people into running from other sports to the management of it. They may be super successful from being head of golf in Northern Ireland or something, but they come to Canada to run athletic, and they don't quite get it in some instinctual way. It's hard to describe. But running is a very special community, and it has its own special chemistry. And I think the best races are those which grow from within the community, those which have been a club, say, the local club. Like, there's a fabulous one at Vancouver, which started as the local club, the Lionsgate Runners, and they started the race. And the first year there were 6 of them or something. I'm exaggerating, but it was very small and very minor, and it just grew from that, and it's continued always to be a community race, and therefore gets much more support from the community than other Canadian marathons that I've experienced. It's moved way on from that now, and now it has professional organization, and sponsorship and so on. But it's still more local. And I think that would be the answer. Don't bring in a group of super race organizers from outside. Find the local people who are able to build and take on the best of the tradition that you've got there, because get wonderful running environment and a great name and potential sponsorship with the way the banks in Canada have supported running. So the possibilities are there. But that's often been the problem. And then, of course, try and find a course that has the minimum traffic intersection and work with the police so that they can be more flexible than they often are.
Yeah, I would say that Montreal has that whole the race circuit, the F1 race circuit, the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve, and a good chunk of the race would be sort of on that little island where there aren't really many people. So maybe there's anyway, hopefully once it gets up and going again, it can be more welcomed and loved.
Maybe. The whole sport in COVID, the whole sport has gone through a kind of self-examination and reconstruction. And the New York Roadrunners have got very much tied up in the whole Black Lives Matter movement, and have made major changes in their organization, because that's become, it seems, their major concern at the moment, which is again a different direction. Probably that wouldn't have happened if COVID hadn't come along and kind of cleared the decks, as it were. And other races are having to look around, and one question we have to ask ourselves is the sport as we know it, as we've built it, and as we've been so proud of it, and as I tried to describe it with great enthusiasm in my book, is that sustainable? Is that sustainable in a post-pandemic world? Can we continue to put together 40,000 people from all around the world, all jammed closely together, all sweating and spitting and rubbing shoulders with each other, and bring them in and put them in little hotel rooms and buses, and do everything which is absolute virus delight? Because the viruses must be rubbing their hands with glee and saying, "Oh yes, oh great, they're starting marathons again, lovely." We are really going to have to look very seriously at that and decide whether we can sustain the sport. And that's not something I've written about yet, but I would float those ideas. My concept is that maybe the great mass field has had its time, and maybe we should subdivide the fields and make a series of smaller races over 2 days, in which, and of course my fantasy then is that you'll have a special over 80 grade and I can win it. Well, you know what I mean. You break things up more, and that would be one possibility. You could still have a great festival of racing, but you wouldn't have the vast numbers all jammed together that has been in a way our delight, and has now become our problem.
It seems that the issue from a COVID point of view is not the race itself. It's either the spectators or the pre-race. How do you get everybody into the city and mass them into the start, or the after race? How do you get them out without bunching everybody together? Because that's where the risks are. Actually, running is not so much.
A big loss for me is that one of the great problems of in a pandemic world is going to be the expos. You've got a whole hundreds of thousands of people jammed together in an indoor space. And that's been that's when I've given talks and sold books and things like that. So that might have to change. We're all going to need to do some very serious thinking. So we need some good writing about it as well.
I agree. Well, this book does a good job of it. I guess I'm a little curious to see what ends up happening. You see sort of different things, different ways that runners have, started competing, popping out here and there, like smaller races and things like that. Even in Quebec, there's been some smaller races that have been accepting registration. Whether or not they're gonna go ahead or be canceled, I guess we'll wait and see and just hope for the best. But the mass events, the big ones, well, I guess we'll see what kind of solutions they come up with.
There's another side to running that we haven't talked about, and it is also in my book. There's this big city mass races and and the whole cultural significance of that, which I described several times. There's also running in the green sense. There's the way that runners have actually become leaders in a lot of creative environmental thinking. And a lot of running events now celebrate the environment in various ways. And maybe the sport will move in that direction. I have a whole chapter, I forget exactly what I call it, Running for the Green or some title like that. And it's about all the different things that running has done for the environment, from races that plant trees. The Chicago Marathon, for instance, sets aside a sum of money and it plants 1/2 mile of trees along its course every year. Well, in a grim concrete environment like Chicago, that's a really enlightened thing to do. And it's going to take a few years for it to have its effect. Or other races. I went to a race in Kenya that was raised money for this particular wildlife preserve. And so we can say quite confidently that 2 species, there's a Grevy's zebra, I think, and the white rhino. White rhino is not literally white, but it has a white patch, that they've been saved and propagated because of runners, because of the money that runners have brought into this annual event. And there's a whole lot of things. The chapter looks at a whole lot of different things like that, races for rivers and races for woods and races where the race awards are not medals, but trees or whatever, all of those things. And that's an aspect of running because it's always been there. I started as a cross-country runner. A lot of people these days start as road runners, but those of us who started as cross-country, running was always, it was about running fast and the opposition, but it was also about the mud and the hills and the dirt and the wind and coping, running fast in that environment and how you got through the muddy patches and how you ran through the creeks and etc. And that is still part of my consciousness. I couldn't now run only on city streets. I always have to find some green. And that's something that running has embodied, and I think is a quite significant leader in the movement. And the whole park run movement, for instance, is a very healthy one. And I think you have some of that in Canada. So that's something where I think there's hope and there's a direction in which running could well move, which would not be a virus problem.
Mm-hmm. I think it's not so much that, you would start as a cross-country runner or a trail runner these days, maybe, and be in the countryside. I think it's just moving your body through the world. I don't know whether you agree, but gives you some sort of natural connection. You feel totally instinctively like a being of nature.
Yeah, I totally agree. In my first book, I had a phrase. I was talking about the joys and rewards of running, and I said I run for the feel of the textures of the earth under my feet.
Yeah, well, we now have much thicker soles.
Yeah, we don't feel much of the textures under our feet, but
we know what you mean.
It was quite nice to get back to the university gymnasium changing rooms in the middle of a busy day of meetings and lectures with sheep shit on my shoes. That's the contact that you're talking about.
Yeah,
Alan. Yes,
one with the earth.
Definitely there. Yes, you are one with the earth, and that's partly why I continue to run.
Yeah, one of your chapters also talks about picking up the different sort of aspects of potential controversy. Talks about the role and participation of women in running events, particularly relevant for you, being the partner of Katherine Switzer, and I think everybody probably listening to this podcast knows her role in running, being one of the first females to run the Boston Marathon. I think reading your chapter, I was wondering, is the participation of women in running a credit to the sport or an embarrassment to the sport?
Well,
in that for so long they couldn't run, or they didn't run, they weren't allowed to run,
or then they couldn't run too far. And even just a few years ago in university,
their uteruses would drop out, or whatever. Yeah.
Or they had unequal distance for competition, like in cross country.
Are we the good guys or are we the bad guys in terms of our sport towards women?
I think we're very much the good guys. One thing that Katherine is always very generous on is that she says that she, as a woman runner, always had support from the male runners. It wasn't the runners that were a problem. It was the officials, and very often female officials, those who had their own little sport, their own little queendom that they controlled, and that they didn't want to grow out of their control. But the male runners, Katherine said, were always very supportive. And of course, I say, well, what a surprise that all of a sudden, you're with a group of blokes training every day, and all of a sudden a 20-year-old in shorts shows up, and
yeah, suddenly everyone's performance is improving.
You're not going to feel strongly opposed to her presence. But then what's happened is that we've discovered that running is in fact the ideal sport. Long distance running is the ideal sport for modern women, because it's something which gives the challenge and the sense of improvement and the community, all of which are very important to them. And women have been extremely good at creating their own running communities. They can fit it in to a very complicated, demanding life, where they're trying to balance work and family and getting the kids off to school. Running is the one thing that you can somehow fit in, even if, as in many cases, people are going out at 5 o'clock in the morning. So it's flexible like that. It can be as solo or as communal as you want to make it. The only negative thing I think that's happened, Alan, is, and this is certainly not in any way the women's fault, is that the number of especially young male runners, seems to be falling away. And you look at the demographics of races, of average road races these days, and the group that used to dominate, which were the 20-some-year-old men, men say from 20 to 32 or something like that, they're almost invisible now. And the dominant numbers are teenagers and older guys, guys from 35 up, say, and the women. That's just how it is. Women, in terms of their total numbers, are in most cases more than 50% now. And I think it's wonderful. The sport is there for them. I'm just delighted to see it. And I often say one of the burdens I have to carry in my life is going every week or so to watch races with hundreds of women running around. And that's often tough. But
can't imagine how that's tough. But
no, we carry these problems. But I don't understand quite why the young men are not coming into running now. I don't understand why it's lost its appeal. Is it because they look around and see a majority of women and therefore feel in some way marginalized? I don't know. It'll probably pass. I hope it will. We might need to find ways of improving the structure of the sport in some way. I mean, like my idea of dividing races up into smaller groups or something like that, so that people are not all mixed up to quite the same degree they are now. But yes, I would totally celebrate it. But my challenge in writing that chapter was that, I mean, obviously I've had a degree of privileged insight into the growth of women's running because of Katherine's role in it. And we've been together since 1983. So I've seen a good chunk of her career and of that process. You know, I've seen some of her Avon races in those days and some of the subsequent races and the growth of the 261 movement and so on. But I didn't want to make it too kind of domestic or I had to tread, I thought, fairly carefully. It was a challenge to write about it in a way that didn't exploit that personal knowledge, but used it to a degree. So I tried to do that by talking about how, you know, I first witnessed the Avon Marathon in London as a complete outsider, just an absolutely intrigued outsider seeing a women's marathon for the first time. And that's when I first glimpsed Katherine on the top of a bus. But of course didn't meet her until 3 years later. So I tried to get that balance and talked about the movement. And it was a very difficult chapter to write because obviously I had a lot of information, but I tried to use stuff that was genuinely personal observation rather than stuff that I had absorbed from her.
Yeah, that must be difficult because sometimes when when you're with someone and you live with them, it's almost like their experiences become your experiences. So it's must have been hard to try and, tease out which ones were your observation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And in a sense, I mean, as a scholar, I will always hold to my own beliefs and values, and one way in which I don't it's not quite true to say I differ from Katherine, but where I place the emphasis differently. Her story obviously is that of the women's marathon, and the story of the marathon, partly because of her charisma and the appeal of the whole story, that's tended to dominate the history of women's running. Well, I said, actually, there's a lot more to women's running than just the marathon, and I remembered, and I put in the book, I remembered running in my little club in England in 1961, 62. And we had a woman who'd been in the English team in the Perth Commonwealth Games, running 800 meters, 880 yards in those days, Joy Jordan. And she was a major influence on me because she was such a nice person. And she and her husband played such a major role in coaching in the club. And I just kind of took it for granted that a woman could be a good runner. Could train just as hard as we did. It was really never an issue, and that was a personal conflict. But then she was running track. There's women's cross country, and I found that women had they had national cross country championships and an international cross country race in 1928. The first women's cross country championship was held in England and in France, and then there was an international race in 1931. Well, those things have never appeared in the history. It's all been the negative stories and how they were stopped from running. Mm-hmm. So I try to tell the story more fully than it's been told before. So from the historical point of view, there is some important stuff in that chapter which nobody else has touched on. And then in my next book, which is due out next April, which is called Running's Greatest Stories, one of the stories I tell there is the story of the 1928 Women's Olympic 800 meters, when supposedly all the women collapsed in an embarrassing way. And it was so embarrassing to everybody that the event was cut from the Olympics for the next 30 years. Well, the short answer is that's all a lot of journalistic
fake news.
Fiction. Absolute fake news. And I did a lot of research, studied the footage, studied the photographs, and have a complete rewrite of that whole episode.
That's fantastic.
Okay, so we're going to be talking to you again in something like May next year.
That'd be great.
We'll be discussing your next book. So don't give all your stories away.
No, that was just a teaser.
There's something to look forward to.
Something that comes up a few times in your book are some of your experiences with the London Marathon. I guess because you were in London for periods, but you also had work jobs, either commentating or covering for journals or whatever, the London Marathon. A couple of things struck me in particular that I might try and get you to comment on. One of my very favorite athletes is Paula Radcliffe. I saw her try to destroy the 10,000 meter Olympic field in 2000 in Sydney and finish fourth, get no medal, and win the hearts of the whole of Australia because of the way she ran from the front. I've never seen her run a marathon, so you describe a little bit the eminent rise of Paula Radcliffe in the London Marathon in 2002, before she became the extreme world record holder. So maybe you could tell me a little bit about that, but also what was it like at the London Marathon in 2013, which was 6 days after the Boston bombings? You were at another marathon 6 days later, big city marathon with the shadow of Boston.
Well, a couple of things, Alan. One, like you, I'm a big fan of Paula Radcliffe. She's one of my absolute favorite competitors, because she's just as tough as old boots. You know, every time I talk to her, she reminds me of all my cross-country mates from the 1950s and 60s, you know, all the Roy Fowler and Jerry North and Mike Turner. And she's a 1950s, 60s English cross-country bloke, really. And she just, the harder it is, the better she likes it. And all of that, absolutely true. And I just love that. Oh, it's not exactly competitiveness, but just the sheer relish in the arduousness of the sport. So I wanted to write about Paula. And you're mentioning that race in Sydney. I just recently, and you could go to it, just recently published an article for Podium Runner in the United States, which is a very, very good website, running outlet. And I did a pre-Olympic piece for them on the basic idea of it was the Olympic creed, that it is better to try hard than to succeed. Words to that effect. And I showed the source of that in 1908, and then gave lots of examples. And one of my examples was Paula running that race, and how she was an absolute Olympic hero for me, because she did all the work and then she finished fourth. And there are a number of examples. Steve Prefontaine finishing fourth in 1972, and other examples like that. And people who have collapsed, and Ron Clark having to get oxygen in 1968, and lots of stories like that. But the whole thing was great runners who actually didn't win Olympic medals. So yes, I agree with you completely on that, and on Paula's heroism. And in a way, I mean, she had a very successful life and career, but there was always this kind of shadow that she actually never got an Olympic medal. She won a world championship, but never an Olympic one. And just the cookie always crumbled in the wrong place for her, and she got injured or whatever. So I wanted to write about her. I wanted to come up with my idea, which you'll remember from that chapter, that really, if we want to get the true status of Paula in London, as she was at that time, then they should name a pub after her. And we should all be able to go and have a beer in the Paula Radcliffe. You know, we can go to the Queen Victoria, and we can go to the Nell Gwyn, and we can go to the Duchess of this and the Countess of that. But I want to be able to go to the Paula Radcliffe, because she's one of the great heroines of London for me.
And in London, there's no greater honor than to have a pub named after you. I think.
Absolutely, no, of course, that's the ultimate. That's more important than being Queen.
All I would say for my part is, if I was Emil Zatopek, I would go and find Paula and give her a gold medal. Yes,
absolutely. No, I agree completely with that. And I've talked to her, and
we heard the story a few weeks ago about Ron Clark receiving in 1966, visiting with Emil Zatopek, and Emil passing him a little parcel, and he eventually discovering that it was one of his gold medals.
Yeah, he opened at the airport. Yeah, or on the plane. Yeah, that's a typical Zatopek gesture. And it showed very good judgment, because Ron Clark is like Paula Radcliffe, one of the world's greatest runners in history. But because of sheer bad luck, partly the 1968 Olympics being at Mexico City altitude, he never got an Olympic gold medal. He got the third. And then, yes, I was regretful that I wasn't in London in 2003 to see Paula run her 2:15. But I was there the year before, and so decided to write about that one. And because this was partly a personal book, that also enabled me to weave in a paragraph at the end about the death of my father, which happened just a few days after I'd seen Paula run that race. And I talked to him sort of literally on his deathbed about seeing that race. And I wanted to have, as I said, it's not an autobiography, but I felt that I wanted to show how, when you're enthusiastic about a sport like running, it still gets all mixed
runs
up
through your life
with the rest of life. You know, life intervenes, and you have to somehow mix it. And I had to go drive straight up from London after covering the race and filing my report. Then I had to drive straight out into the Surrey countryside and go and visit him in the nursing home. So I wanted to get that personal element as well, not in any labored way, I thought, but just enough to acknowledge that we all have lives that we have to deal with. And his had been partly a sporting life anyway, and he was certainly a major influence on me getting interested in sport. So yes, that's what I tried to do in that chapter, and talk about Paula. Just as, I mean, she was just so wonderfully aggressive, but yet also so intelligent. I mean, she is really smart, and she's really. I mean, I've heard her conduct a press conference in Berlin in English, French, and German.
That's impressive.
Yeah, she just does her. I mean, she got first class degree at Loughborough University in languages, and you know she's smart tactically as well. Because I remember talking about that race, you know, she saw that she'd run 1 mile and it was getting close down to 5 minutes, and she thought, whoops, you know, this is too fast. So she backed off a bit, and she's thinking all the time. She didn't look as if she was thinking because her head was bobbing up and down, and she, you know,
not the most stylish.
Yeah, she's not stylish in the upper body, but you look at those legs, those great prancing legs, and she is and was astonishing. No, I'm a huge admirer of Paula. I enjoyed every conversation I've ever had with her, and so wanted to write about her. And I had to stretch it a little bit to think of that as a day when running made history, but you can see you've nailed it, Alan. I really wanted to talk about those things, and also London. Yes, and then London is such an important marathon. I've never run it, which is one of my regrets.
It's not too late.
No, it's not. And then in 2013, and that was really extraordinary from a personal point of view, because I'd been in Boston. That had been a terrible experience in all sorts of ways, and largely the media frenzy that followed the bombing. And people found, you know, the news began to get around the media that Katherine and I were there in the hotel room. The phone never stopped ringing. People rang us from around the world literally all night. I mean, absolutely literally, completely ruthless. I learned a lot about media, you know, and I don't want to be too critical of it, because I worked for media and was working for media at that time. But you realize that with modern media, there are all these thousands and thousands and thousands of different outlets, and they all want to have their person on the spot. And if they can find a personal contact there, they will be absolutely relentless and ruthless at forcing you to comment and preferably getting you to cry.
Good box office.
Well, and it was hard not to when you're in a state of total exhaustion. It'd been very hard for us to get anything to eat. We'd had literally no sleep for 2 nights. And then I had to get up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning and get myself out to Logan Airport and fly to London. So by the time I got to London, I was in a state of considerable exhaustion. And then, of course, the atmosphere in London was so different, because by then, who was it? Right? One of you quoted the runners. Yes, it was you, Alan, quoted the runners of Boston, who said, if they want to break the human spirit, they've made the wrong choice by starting with runners. And that, and I actually quote that in my book. And that was what was evident in London. You know, people were in a state of grief and shock, yes, but also a state of great resilience and determination that they were going to make their event happen. And of course, being Brits, this is the time when the Boston police were pursuing the bombers, and almost everybody I met and finally they caught them with that dramatic event. Every Brit I met had yet more ingenious ideas of what they wanted to do to the anatomy of the bombers when they were caught.
Yeah.
And this was kind of a very Brit way of, as it were, handling the crisis, you know, handling the shock, handling the resentment, and turning it into something of a joke.
Yeah, the dark humor.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, I have it and do it myself. But the atmosphere there was just so extraordinary, because it was this mix, and really the sport and the running community handled it, I thought, so well, because it was a mix of respect and grief, but also resilience and determination and celebration. And so before the start of the race, for instance, they had a minute's silence in respect for the people who died at Boston. And then there was this absolute outburst of huge cheering. I think everybody out on the course was wearing some Boston symbol, Boston cap or Boston Strong t-shirt or ribbon or something. I think everybody in London was showing respect for what had happened in Boston. And it was one of those days when you realized, again, my book is called When Running Made History. You realize that running is not just it's not just tennis, as it were, or badminton or golf or something. It's a sport which is much more central to society and which expresses the community in ways that most sports don't do. And it does that especially because it's not a spectator sport, it's a participant sport. So the majority of people are actually doing it rather than watching it, and that makes a big difference to people's involvement with the sport. You and I, Alan, are great soccer fans, but it's different being a runner, because running is something which is actually in our blood because we do it, whereas we don't actually. Well, maybe you do play soccer, but we don't play soccer anymore. And we just admire those in our clubs who play it and usually lose.
Unfortunately, yes.
So I guess the last chapter, we don't want to keep you too long, but the last chapter was about running into older age, and I think that this chapter is it was just one chapter, and this could probably be a whole book. But you've been a runner your whole life, and you are still running at the end of this book. So I'm assuming you're still running now. And what kind of wisdom can you pass on to everybody else that wants to run for a long time, or maybe for people that are that didn't run all their life, but now they want to start running?
The first story, somebody asked me recently, I think it was a questionnaire on aging. Can you adjust to the fact of running slower than you used to? And my answer was, well, you don't have any choice.
Unfortunately,
you've got to adjust. So that's it's just the reality that you do get slower as you get older. But then the big question is it worthwhile doing something when you're doing it so much in such a way that's so inferior to how you used to? Well, yes, it is very much so. And you set new targets, and maybe the point will come when I feel I'm running so slowly that it's just embarrassing, and so I stop. I have recently, within the last year, I've made one or two decisions, like not to run cross country anymore, unless it's really good conditions, like on a golf course or something like that. Because now with two artificial knees and at 82, I just can't handle the uneven footing. I just can't keep the rhythm going over broken ground like I used to. It's not so much the uphills. I can't run the downhills, so I can do the uphills. But so if I could find a course that was entirely uphill on firm footing, I could do. So what I'm saying is that your choices become more limited, and there are some things you can't do. I very much doubt, despite what you said about London, I doubt that I'll run a marathon, because I'm just not prepared to put in the training that it would require. It used to be that 2.5 hours training run was all that I required to run a 2 hours 20 marathon. But now my marathon at best would be, 5 hours or something like that. Well, I don't want to go out there and train for 5 hours. I don't want to give up that much of the day, and I'm not sure that I could sustain it, because I find already, if I do an hour's hard run, I need an hour's sleep afterwards. So those things you have to adjust to. But then your bigger question is if people are thinking of starting running, absolutely, and it's enormously satisfying, just that sense of making progress, the sense of your body adjusting to this effort and learning to do it. You will lose weight. That shouldn't be the main objective, but you'll keep your weight under control. You'll relish life more. You'll relish your food and and the whole experience of living more, even the napping after the race. I after a hard run, I enjoy that. I still love the company. We have a group here in Wellington who are called the Grumpy Old Men, and we get together once a month and talk about how great we were as runners.
And you get greater and greater every time you meet.
Oh, absolutely, of course, yes. And so in other words, the personal satisfaction is still there, though it may not be as great as when you're racing really well, to be honest. But the personal satisfaction is still there, having a good run, a good race, or a good training session. That's still there. The communal satisfaction is still there. The friends I have in life, most of them now are people from the running community. Now, I've kept some from my university life selectively, but most of my ongoing friends are in running. It gives you a place. I have my place both as the elder statesman and also doing the historical work for both in here and in America, and the writing that I do. And it's nice at this age to still actually have a function, to still have a real role that you fulfill, and the challenges that you have to meet, and deadlines that you have to meet, and so on. So all of that's good. I wouldn't stop. I mean, I've had to stop several times. Every time I have another knee replaced. Or last year I broke a fibula in one leg because of rolling the ankle, and so that was another 4 months off. So I don't know how many comebacks I've made. It's in the several hundreds.
Actually, I really like your at one point you talk about your personal bests, but they're now like your post first knee replacement personal best, and post second knee replacement personal best. So I thought that was great.
So well, in other words, you just keep readjusting your targets. Still, in my little training diary, I still use the term world record. And this is me going out and doing a particular course, and I know it's a world record because I'm the only person who knows that course. I don't tell anybody else. So I retain not only the world record, but the best 10 times ever done on that.
Well, I can't even check up where you're running on Strava because you've got this Casio watch that doesn't connect. Very sneaky. So we heard about a little bit about a book that you're writing in the future. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit more about what you're currently up to and what's next for Roger.
I keep doing various writing projects. I write for this very good outlet in America called Podium Runner. Did one piece for the Olympics that I mentioned about great Olympians who didn't win medals, and another piece that was connected to the Sifan Hassan attempt to win 3 gold medals. And it was about people who'd won multiple medals at games, like Emil Zatopek, for instance, and Nurmi and Tiranish Dibaba. So I do that kind of writing. I do some writing for Runner's World, and especially the obituaries, which is important work that I take very seriously. But then the book is being published by Meyer & Meyer, and it's called Running's Greatest Stories. And it's with them at the minute, so I haven't actually done anything on it for maybe 2 months. And I don't know when final proofs will appear. But I've always had it in mind to write a history of running, but there are 2 or 3 of those, and they're actually pretty boring, the entire history of running. So what I decided was that wasn't what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was tell the best stories.
Yeah.
And they're mixed. The basic choice I made is they need to be significant stories, and they need to be stories where I can contribute something original because of the research I've done. So it starts with Atalanta, the great Greek legend of the woman runner. And it comes through stories like Spiridon Lewis winning the 1896 Olympics, and Dorando Pietri in the 1908 London Marathon, and one I mentioned, the 1928 women's 800 meters, the Roger Bannister 4-minute mile, and the whole context of that, where I had some original stuff to contribute. It's, I think, 13 chapters, which go from ancient Greece to 1980. One chapter is about the first women's Olympic marathon. And it tells what I was talking about a little while ago, the full story of women's running, with the marathon just in that context. And so it's both stories and then research that tries to establish the exact truth about, well, how did we get 26 miles, 385 yards, 42.2. All the stories are only half truth at best. All the stuff about the children watching from the royal nurseries or moving the finish line, so it's opposite the Queen, none of that is actually verifiably true. And I've actually established just why it was. And the short answer is probably the original course was not that exact distance, but we're stuck with it. So that's the next one. Again, good. What I really like doing, which is telling good running stories with a substantial kind of element of original research in it.
And if people want to follow you, I don't know if you're a social media person, but
I do Facebook, not very religiously. I mostly use Facebook to put up articles that I've just published, or sometimes give another run to previous articles.
If people follow you on Facebook, they can find the link to your latest podium runner or your latest whatever.
Yes.
Yeah,
That's what I use it for. Yeah. I've never been interested in doing the personal thing and saying, what we had for breakfast today, and and here's me feeding the birds or whatever.
People would copy you and then become world masters champions, of course.
Well, maybe they would. I have being British and Kiwi. I have a certain degree of inhibition about giving away too much of the personal. But the publisher tells me that I'm going to have to get into Instagram and all kinds of other stuff to promote the book. So stand by. This is going to be a technological challenge for me.
It's okay. Instagram, there's not really much you can do with it. You can post pictures and you can write a little blurb, but not too extensive. So I think you're going to be fine. If you have Facebook, you're going to be fine with Instagram. I'm confident.
Okay. That's reassuring. Thank you. But I'll put up just for instance the link to this podcast. So you'll tell me when it's going to be up, and then I'll put up the link, and then all my thousands of followers can
millions.
Yes, we're going to up that number.
So what we'll do is just before thanking you and saying goodbye, Liz and I will just give our summary thoughts on the book, which we traditionally do towards the end. Trouble with trying to do summary phrases for people who are literary powerhouses creates some degree of challenge for me. But if I was to take this book and sum it up in one phrase, I would say this is a great running history and running experience told by a literary master with childlike enthusiasm. If you like anything about running, there's something in here to get the hairs on your neck standing up with excitement. There's some great black and white photographs and excellent sporting and literary references as well as sporting at the back. So there's an extensive sort of reference section.
I thought for me it was a fantastic history lesson. I know it wasn't meant to be like a documented kind of history of running. It was Roger's personal experience with the sport and all the things that he has witnessed. But for me, I mean, I think there was enough history mixed in there because there was definitely a lot of research that went into this book, as well as, accounting personal stories and observations. It's a great book for fans of the sport. And I love that Roger put into words what I always thought of the sport, but I could never really describe to anybody. If everyone was a runner, we would have a different world, which is more inclusive. And I think I feel that way as well. I know it's not perfect, but I've always felt like, for me, even when I was a kid, the running team was always the place where I felt the most at home. Roger's accounts of how running changed certain things for the environment, for inclusivity, how the running boom came to be in the United States in the 1970s with all the races that ended up popping up and everybody getting into these kind of grassroots movements. It really sort of summed up what I've always kind of felt in the sport of running, but never really put into words. So I thought this book was fantastic. And anybody that likes good stories, is a fan of the sport, if you like to read like sort of memoirs, you'd like this book.
Well, thank you both. I really appreciate the how seriously you've done the job and read it. Having tried to teach students to study literature for 40 years.
What you need to do is you need to give them running books.
Yeah, if there's one thing this podcast is not for us, it's not work. It's a labor of love. You know, we're not interested in making money by doing this podcast. We're interested in professing our love for the sport of running. And you're certainly someone that helps us to do that very easily. So we thank you for that, Roger.
I have a Larson cartoon on my wall. Actually, it's in our house in America where not Larson, Snoopy. Snoopy's sitting at his typewriter, and Lucy says, "I hear you have a 6-figure contract for your next book." And Snoopy's typing away, and Lucy says, "What are the 6 figures?" And Snoopy thinks, "Oh."
Well, maybe we'll convert your last figure into a 1. You never know.
That sums up. That's why I sometimes say my first book, Heroes and Sparrows, sold 1 copy in New Zealand, which has now been read by 43,000 different runners.
Passing around. It'll reach me eventually.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Running Book Reviews podcast. Big thank you to the publisher, Syracuse University Press, for providing a review copy of the book. And a big thanks to Roger Robinson for spending time with us today. If you would like to leave us feedback about how we can improve the podcast or want to suggest a book that you'd like us to review in a future podcast, please leave us a comment on social media. We are Running Book Reviews on Facebook and Instagram, and on Twitter, we are reviews_running. Please also follow us on social media to find out about new episodes when they're released, or you can just subscribe to the podcast on your favorite streaming platform. Bye for now.